What happens when the Cold War between two of the Middle East's biggest rivals suddenly turns hot? For decades, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia shaped nearly every major conflict in the Middle East, from proxy wars in Yemen and Syria, to oil politics, to religious influence. Riyadh and Tehran fought each other indirectly. But now, that shadow war may have crossed a dangerous line. After massive U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iranian targets triggered retaliation across the Gulf, reports began emerging that Saudi Arabia quietly launched direct strikes on Iranian territory for the first time in modern history. If true, this changes everything. Because this is no longer just Israel versus Iran. This is becoming a regional war, and the consequences could reshape oil markets, global trade routes, military alliances, and the future of the Middle East itself. Today we'll break down what triggered this crisis, why Iran targeted Gulf states, why Saudi Arabia reportedly decided to strike back, how the US and Israel are involved, why the Strait of Hormuz matters to the entire world, and whether this conflict could spiral into a much larger war. Let's begin. The roots of this crisis go back years. Tensions between Iran and Israel had already been reaching dangerous levels through covert operations, cyber attacks, assassinations, and proxy conflicts across the Middle East. But according to multiple recent reports, things escalated dramatically after a major U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign targeted Iranian military and strategic infrastructure earlier this year. Iran viewed those attacks as an existential threat, and Tehran responded the way it usually does, not by fighting only one enemy directly, but by expanding pressure across the entire region. Soon after the strikes, Iranian missiles and drones reportedly targeted multiple Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. Oil infrastructure became a key target. Why? Because Iran understands one simple reality. The Gulf's economic power depends on energy exports. And if Iran's economy is being destroyed through sanctions, war, and blockades, Tehran wants the rest of the region to feel the pain too. Saudi Arabia reportedly intercepted several missiles aimed toward strategic military and energy sites, including areas near Riyadh and critical oil infrastructure. At the same time, Iran warned Gulf nations against supporting U.S. military operations. Tehran's message was simple. If your territory is used against Iran, you become part of the war. That warning terrified Gulf leaders, because for years, countries like Saudi Arabia tried balancing two goals. 1. Maintaining security ties with the United States. 2. Avoiding direct war with Iran. But once Iranian missiles started crossing borders, that balance began collapsing. This is where things become historic. For decades, Saudi Arabia avoided direct military confrontation with Iran itself. Yes, Riyadh fought Iranian-backed groups. Yes, it supported rivals across the region. But direct attacks on Iranian soil, that was almost unthinkable. Saudi Arabia traditionally depended heavily on American military protection. But according to recent reports from Reuters and other international outlets, Saudi Arabia may have crossed that line for the first time. Reuters. Western and Iranian officials reportedly said Saudi Arabia launched covert retaliatory strikes on Iran in late March after Iranian attacks targeted Saudi territory. Reuters. The strikes were allegedly carried out quietly and without public acknowledgement, and that secrecy matters, because Saudi Arabia appears to be trying two things at once, showing Iran it can retaliate militarily, while also preventing a full-scale regional war. In other words, Riyadh wants deterrence without total escalation. But that's a very dangerous game, especially in the Middle East. Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan warned publicly that Gulf patience was not unlimited, and said the kingdom reserved the right to take military action if attacks continued. Al Jazeera. Those statements were unusually aggressive for Saudi diplomacy, and they revealed something important. Saudi Arabia no longer believes passive defense is enough. The kingdom now appears willing to strike back directly. That represents a major geopolitical shift. To understand why global markets are panicking, you need to understand the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway between Iran and the Gulf states is one of the most important trade choke points on Earth. Roughly one-fifth of the world's oil supply passes through it. That means any disruption there can immediately impact oil prices, inflation, shipping costs, global stock markets, energy security worldwide. Iran has repeatedly threatened to disrupt Hormuz whenever tensions rise. And during this crisis, reports suggested Iran imposed major restrictions and increased military pressure around the area. Oil prices surged. Shipping insurance costs exploded. Global markets became nervous. Why? Because if Hormuz closes completely, the world economy could face another major energy shock. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE tried reducing dependence on Hormuz through alternative pipelines. Saudi Arabia especially has some ability to export oil through Red Sea routes, but even Saudi Arabia cannot fully escape the consequences of regional instability. And that's exactly why Iran targets Gulf infrastructure. Tehran knows it cannot match America militarily, but it can create enough economic chaos to pressure the world into demanding de-escalation. That strategy has become central to Iranian deterrence. Now let's talk about Israel, because Israel remains one of the biggest drivers behind this confrontation. For years, Israeli leaders warned that Iran's growing missile capabilities and nuclear ambitions represented an existential threat. That fear intensified after Iran strengthened ties with armed groups across the region, including Hezbollah and other militias. Israeli officials increasingly believed time was running out, and according to multiple reports, the U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran was designed to weaken Tehran's military infrastructure before Iran became even harder to contain. Reuters. But there's a problem with military campaigns against Iran. Iran rarely responds conventionally. Instead, Tehran expands the battlefield. That means missile attacks, drone warfare, cyber attacks, proxy operations, maritime disruption, regional destabilization, and suddenly, a conflict that begins between Israel and Iran spreads across the entire Middle East. That appears to be exactly what happened here. As Iran retaliated regionally, Gulf states became exposed, and Saudi Arabia eventually appears to have concluded that simply absorbing attacks would invite even more aggression. So Riyadh responded, quietly but forcefully. At first glance, Gulf countries look extremely powerful: huge oil wealth, advanced weapons, massive infrastructure projects, global investment influence. But this crisis exposed a major vulnerability. Most Gulf economies depend heavily on stability, and war destroys stability. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 project depends on transforming the kingdom into a global business, tourism, and investment hub. Mega projects like NEOM require foreign investors to feel confident about the region's future, but missile strikes change investor psychology immediately. No investor wants billions trapped inside a war zone. Reports already suggest the broader conflict delayed economic ambitions across the Gulf. Qatar reportedly suffered major energy disruptions. The UAE faced infrastructure pressure. Saudi Arabia avoided the worst damage partly because of its Red Sea export routes. Still, the message was clear. Even the wealthiest Gulf states are vulnerable, and Iran wants them to feel that vulnerability. Something bigger is happening here beyond missiles and airstrikes. This conflict may be reshaping the Middle East's power structure. For years, Gulf states increasingly moved toward diplomacy with Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran even restored diplomatic ties after years of hostility. China played a major role in facilitating that détente. Many analysts believed the region was entering a less confrontational phase, but the recent war appears to have shattered much of that trust. Saudi officials reportedly said confidence in Iran had been completely shattered after attacks on Gulf states. Now Gulf leaders face difficult questions. Can diplomacy with Iran still work? Can economic modernization survive constant regional conflict? Can the United States still guarantee Gulf security? Or will Gulf states increasingly develop independent military strategies? That last question matters enormously, because Saudi Arabia's reported strikes suggest Riyadh may no longer rely solely on Washington for deterrence. Instead, Saudi Arabia may be signaling, if we are attacked, we will strike back ourselves. That changes the entire regional equation. Now let's talk about America. because the United States sits at the center of this crisis whether Washington likes it or not. For decades, the U.S. security system protected Gulf monarchies. American military bases across the region acted as deterrents against Iran. But recent events exposed growing uncertainty. Many Gulf states fear becoming battlegrounds whenever Washington confronts Tehran. At the same time, America also fears losing influence in the Middle East as China and Russia expand their roles. This creates a strategic dilemma. The U.S. wants to contain Iran, but it also wants to avoid another endless Middle Eastern war. That balancing act is becoming harder. Reports indicate the cost of the war and military operations has already become politically controversial inside the United States. American policymakers now face difficult choices: escalate further against Iran, push for diplomacy, protect Gulf allies more aggressively, or reduce involvement altogether. None of those options are easy, because every move risks triggering bigger consequences. This is the question everyone is asking, and the answer is complicated. Right now, most regional powers appear to want controlled escalation, not total war. Even Saudi Arabia reportedly maintained diplomatic communication with Iran after retaliatory strikes. That suggests both sides understand how catastrophic a direct war could become. But wars don't always escalate intentionally. Sometimes escalation happens because of miscalculations, miscommunication, domestic political pressure, accidental civilian casualties, economic panic, or military overreaction. The Middle East is full of overlapping alliances and rivalries. One strike can trigger another. One interception failure can change everything. And once national pride becomes involved, backing down becomes politically dangerous. That's why even limited confrontations between Iran and Saudi Arabia are extremely risky, because neither side wants to appear weak. Some people might think this is just another Middle Eastern conflict. It's not. This crisis affects the entire world. Here's why. If Gulf oil infrastructure remains under threat, global fuel prices can spike rapidly. That impacts transportation, inflation, food prices, and economic growth worldwide. The Strait of Hormuz is essential for global energy flows. Any disruption affects shipping markets everywhere. Investors hate instability. Regional wars trigger uncertainty across global markets. This conflict also involves the strategic interests of the United States, China, Russia, European powers. Everyone has something at stake. Iran's nuclear program remains a major issue, and every military escalation increases fears that diplomacy could collapse entirely. Perhaps the most important takeaway from all this is what Saudi Arabia's reported response signals to the region. For years, Riyadh was often viewed as cautious militarily when dealing directly with Iran. But now, the kingdom may be entering a new phase. A phase where Saudi Arabia becomes more willing to use direct force to defend itself. That could reshape Middle Eastern geopolitics for years, because if Saudi Arabia adopts a more aggressive deterrent strategy, Iran may respond by strengthening its own regional pressure networks even further, and that risks creating a long-term cycle of retaliation. The Middle East may have entered a new era. What began as U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran quickly expanded into a regional confrontation involving Gulf states, oil infrastructure, missile warfare, and direct retaliation. Saudi Arabia's reported strikes on Iranian territory, if fully confirmed, represent one of the most important geopolitical developments in the region in years, because they suggest the old rules are changing. The shadow war is becoming more direct, and when major regional powers begin attacking each other openly, the risk of a much larger conflict rises dramatically. For now, diplomacy continues behind the scenes, but trust between Iran and the Gulf appears deeply damaged, and the next few months could determine whether the Middle East moves toward fragile de-escalation or toward an even bigger war, because once missiles start crossing borders, history rarely stays contained. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe to the channel for deep geopolitical analysis, global power shifts, economic warfare, and the stories mainstream media often misses. And tell me in the comments, do you think Saudi Arabia's response will deter Iran or push the Middle East closer to a regional war? Until next time, stay informed.